Sir, I'm going to need you to step outside with me.
I'm waiting for my car to be serviced. What exactly is suspicious about that?
We got a call. Someone matching your description was seen circling cars in the lot. Stand up.
Matching my description? You mean black?
I'm not going to ask you again. Stand up right now or I'm taking you out of here in cuffs.
Dominic Cross was not just a man in a waiting room, he was a walking nightmare for bad police officers. In the legal world of Atlanta, he was known as the Cop Hunter. This was a name he earned through 9 years of hard work in the Civil Rights Unit. While most people saw a man in a black shirt and blue jeans, the records in his office told a much different story. Dominic had prosecuted 31 police officers for breaking the law they were supposed to protect. His record was nearly perfect, with 28 convictions that ended careers and took away pensions. Dominic was famous for being very careful and never giving up. He didn't care about making friends in local police stations, he cared about the law. He had spent 5 years as a public defender, watching poor people get treated unfairly by the system. That experience made him want to change things from the inside. He moved to the Department of Justice to make sure that a badge was not a license to bully people. Dominic's biggest win was a famous case called United States versus Harrison. In that case, he sent an entire group of drug officers to federal prison for stealing money and planting fake evidence. Because of his work, he had secured $95 million in settlements for victims who had been mistreated by the police. He was a graduate of Harvard Law and a man who knew every trick in the book. Some officers used the name Cop Hunter as an insult, but the smart ones used it as a warning. They knew that if Dominic Cross was looking at your case, you were in big trouble. As he sat on the modern gray sofa at the dealership, he looked like any other person checking his phone. But inside his head, he was a lead prosecutor who had seen every type of corrupt behavior imaginable. He was calm because he knew the power he held. He didn't know yet that Officer Brandon Hauer was about to become number 32 on his list, but Dominic was always ready for a fight. He had spent his life building cases that outlasted the people he put away, and today would be no different. Officer Brandon Hauer did not earn his badge through hard work or honesty. He was only on the force for 14 weeks, but his path to the uniform was already filled with secrets. Before joining the Atlanta police, Hauer had tried to get jobs at 2 other police departments. Both of those places turned him down after looking into his past. One county found that he had a very bad attitude during his mental health tests, and another found that he made mean comments during his training. Under normal rules, Hauer never should have been hired. However, he had a powerful secret weapon, his cousin, David Hauer. David was a member of the city council, a politician with enough power to make problems disappear. David spoke directly to the police chief and pushed his cousin's application through the system. He made sure that the warnings from other departments were ignored or called personality differences instead of red flags. Because of this help, Brandon Hauer was given a gun and a badge without being properly checked. He walked onto the streets with a history of targeting minorities during his stops. In a short time as a cop, he had 19 interactions with citizens. Out of those 19 people, 17 were black or Hispanic, and he never actually arrested any of them or gave them a ticket. He just liked to stop them, demand their ID, and ask why they were in certain neighborhoods. Hauer even joked about this behavior in private text messages with his friends. He believed that rich areas were the best places to work because people would call the police for any small reason. He thought he was untouchable because his cousin was a politician. He entered Prestige Motors that Saturday afternoon with calcified certainty, which meant his mind was already made up before he even saw Dominic Cross. He wasn't there to serve the public, he was there to show off the power he didn't actually deserve. The Mercedes-AMG GT was more than just a fast car to Dominic Cross. It was a reward for years of standing up for the truth. Dominic had spent 3 years bringing it to Prestige Motors for service, ever since he was promoted to lead prosecutor of the Civil Rights Unit. The car was expensive and flashy, and he knew it was a big treat for himself. But to him, every mile on the odometer represented a victory in the courtroom. Before he became a prosecutor, Dominic spent 5 years as a public defender. During those years, he worked in the trenches of the legal system, watching poor clients lose their cases because the system was broken. He saw how much damage a dishonest officer could do to a family. Instead of giving up, he decided to change the system from the inside. He moved to the Department of Justice and spent 4 more years building massive cases that finally held the police accountable for their actions. By the time he sat in the dealership lounge that Saturday, Dominic had been an assistant U.S. attorney for 9 years. He was the man who led the case against an entire narcotics unit for stealing and lying. Because of his hard work, he had earned a Harvard Law degree and a top position as the chief of the Civil Rights Unit. The luxury car was the one thing he allowed himself to enjoy after a decade of fighting for people who had nothing. He sat on the gray sofa in his weekend clothes, jeans and a black shirt, feeling like he had earned his place in that high-end showroom. He was a man of high status, but today, he was just a customer waiting for his car in Bay 3. He didn't know that his choice of casual clothes would soon be used against him by people who only looked at the surface. Prestige Motors was a place where everything was shiny and expensive. The showroom had huge glass windows that showed off cars like Porsches and BMWs that cost over $100,000. The people who came there were usually rich doctors, lawyers, or business bosses. On this day, a woman in her mid-50s was walking through the BMW section. She was carrying a designer handbag and acting like she owned the place. As she looked around, her eyes landed on Dominic Cross. He was sitting on a modern gray sofa, quietly looking at files on his phone while he waited for his car in Bay 3. He was wearing a black shirt and jeans, simple clothes for a Saturday afternoon. The woman watched him for a moment, then she went to find the manager. She didn't speak quietly. "There is a man in the lounge who doesn't look like he belongs here," she said. She told the manager that she didn't feel comfortable and asked if he could do something about it. She didn't have a real reason to be upset. Dominic was just sitting there peacefully. The manager, Gerald Patterson, looked over at Dominic. He didn't see a Harvard graduate or a powerful federal prosecutor who had handled 31 big cases. He only saw what his own bias told him to see: a black man in casual clothes sitting in a fancy room. Instead of asking Dominic if he needed help or checking the service records, Patterson decided to listen to the woman's complaint. He looked at her and said, "I'll handle it, ma'am." Gerald Patterson went back into his quiet office and shut the door. He didn't check the service computer to see why Dominic was there. He didn't ask the sales staff if they had spoken to the man on the sofa. Instead, he picked up the phone and dialed 911. He spoke with a voice that sounded very sure of himself as he reported a suspicious individual at Prestige Motors. Patterson told the police dispatcher that a black male was possibly casing vehicles in the showroom. To case a vehicle means to look at it secretly because you plan to steal it. When the dispatcher asked what the man was actually doing, Patterson admitted the truth without even realizing it: he's just sitting there. He had been sitting there for 20 minutes, which is exactly what customers do when they wait for their cars. Patterson gave the dispatcher a description of Dominic's clothes, the jeans and the black shirt. By making this call, the manager turned a peaceful afternoon into a crime scene. He used words like suspicious to make a normal situation sound dangerous. He didn't see the danger he was creating for himself or the dealership. At 2:09 p.m., the call was sent out to the police. Officer Brandon Hauer was the one who answered it. He was only a few minutes away, and he was already heading toward the dealership with his mind made up. Patterson hung up the phone, thinking he was protecting his business, but he had actually just started the clock on the end of his own career. At 2:12 p.m., the glass doors of the showroom opened with a soft chime. Officer Brandon Hauer walked inside, and he did not look like he was there to help. He walked with his hand near his belt, showing a posture that suggested he had already decided Dominic was a criminal before they even spoke. Hauer was only 14 weeks onto the job, but he moved with a type of fake confidence that usually leads to trouble. On his chest, his body camera was already running, recording every second of the encounter. Dominic looked up from his phone and immediately recognized the way the officer was walking. As a prosecutor who had watched hundreds of hours of police videos, he knew exactly what was about to happen. He saw an officer approaching with a mind that was already calcified, meaning Hauer was not going to listen to reason. Hauer marched straight toward the lounge where Dominic was sitting. He didn't say hello or ask if Dominic was a customer. Instead, he used a cold, demanding voice. "Sir, I need you to step outside," Hauer commanded. Dominic did not stand up. He stayed relaxed and used the calm, measured voice he always used in a courtroom. He looked the officer in the eye and asked, "Is there a problem, officer?" Hauer claimed he had a report of a man casing vehicles who matched Dominic's description. Dominic knew this was a trap. He set his phone down and asked a very important question: what description would that be? The officer's only answer was black male. Hauer's jaw tightened in frustration because Dominic was not acting afraid. The officer told Dominic that being a black male in a car dealership was enough of a reason for him to investigate. Dominic stayed calm and told the officer that being black in a dealership is not a crime and does not give the police a legal reason to stop someone. He told Hauer that he was a customer and that the officer could prove it in 30 seconds by talking to the service department. Hauer refused to check the service records. Instead, he reached for his handcuffs and told Dominic he could either walk outside on his own or leave in chains. Dominic looked at the officer's nameplate and read his badge number out loud. He then told Hauer exactly who he was. "I am Assistant United States Attorney Dominic Cross. I have prosecuted 31 police officers for doing exactly what you are doing right now." Dominic warned the officer that his career was over because he was threatening a federal prosecutor for sitting in a lounge. Hauer just laughed and said, "Sure you are," because he didn't believe a prosecutor would be wearing jeans. Dominic offered to show his ID, but Hauer didn't want to see it. The situation turned into a crime when Hauer reached out and grabbed Dominic's arm with a very tight grip. He yanked Dominic upward with a lot of force just to show that he was in charge. Dominic did not fight back because he knew that resisting would give the officer an excuse to use more violence. Instead, Dominic stood up and spoke clearly so the body camera would hear him. "I am not resisting. This is an unlawful detention and an assault." The sound of the struggle in the lounge carried across the showroom and into the service area. Suddenly, a man in a blue Prestige Motors uniform came running from the back. His name was Thomas, and he was a service technician who had known Dominic for years. When he saw the officer yanking Dominic's arm, his face turned pale with fear and shock. "Stop! Stop!" Thomas shouted as he rushed toward them. He was holding a clipboard with an official work order on it. He thrust the paper toward Officer Hauer so the officer could see the name printed at the very top. "That is Mr. Cross. He is a federal prosecutor," Thomas yelled. He pointed toward the service bay and explained that Dominic's Mercedes was being worked on right at that moment. The officer's grip on Dominic's arm loosened as he looked at the clipboard. For the first time, Hauer's face lost its color. He realized that Dominic wasn't lying about who he was. Thomas didn't stop there. He looked at the officer with disgust and said, "I heard him from the service entrance. He told you exactly who he was." Dominic calmly straightened his black shirt where Hauer's hand had wrinkled the fabric. He didn't look scared. He looked like a man who was now in total control of the room. He looked at the rookie officer and used a voice that was cold and firm. "Officer Hauer, badge number 5523, Dominic said. You will stay in this building until I say you can leave. Do you understand?" Dominic then reached into his pocket and pulled out his gold badge and Department of Justice ID. He held it up so the officer and his body camera could see the official federal seal. The mistake Hauer had made was now permanent, and Dominic was ready to make sure there were consequences. Dominic reached for his phone, which was still sitting on the sofa where it had fallen during the struggle. He didn't look at the crowd of customers who were now recording everything on their own phones. Instead, he dialed a direct line to his office. When the call connected, he didn't sound like a victim, he sounded like a boss. "This is Dominic Cross," he said firmly. "Get me the U.S. Marshal on duty and start a new case file. I am currently at Prestige Motors, and I am about to become the victim in one of my own cases." On the other end of the line, his team moved with professional urgency. They asked if he was safe, and Dominic confirmed that the officer had finally released his arm. He then began to dictate the details of the crime as if he were writing a legal report in real time. He gave the officer's name, his badge number, and the list of laws that had been broken: unlawful detention, assault, and civil rights violations under the color of law. Dominic told his team to notify the FBI and the office that watches over police behavior. He wanted federal agents on the scene immediately. When he hung up the phone, he turned his attention back to Officer Hauer, who was standing perfectly still near the showroom door. Hauer's face now looked like wet cement, gray and heavy with the realization of what he had done. "Officer, I am going to tell you what happens next," Dominic said, using the same calm tone he used when talking to a jury. "I have been on the other side of this conversation 31 times before." He explained that the FBI would arrive within the hour. They would take the body camera as evidence, they would take the dealership's security tapes, and they would interview the woman who started all of this. Hauer tried to say he was just doing his job, but Dominic cut him off. "Your job isn't to ignore the law," Dominic said. As the sound of federal sirens began to wail in the distance, Dominic looked at the rookie and told him the truth. "That sound? That is your career ending." The federal sirens grew louder, and unlike the local police sirens, these had a sharp, urgent pitch that signaled the arrival of the big guns. 2 black SUVs with federal government plates pulled into the dealership lot with quiet speed. The people inside the showroom watched as the FBI arrived to take over the scene because they take attacks on federal prosecutors very seriously. Special Agent Denise Crawford was the first to walk into the showroom. She had worked on cases with Dominic for 5 years, and she knew him well. Her face looked worried when she first saw Dominic, but it turned very hard and angry when she saw Officer Hauer standing there in his uniform. She immediately asked Dominic if he was hurt. Dominic told her he was okay, but he made it clear that he had been assaulted. He pointed out that all the proof was on his phone, the dealership's cameras, and the officer's own body camera. Agent Crawford turned to Officer Hauer and showed him her federal ID. She told him that he was being detained while they investigated the crime. She spoke with total authority and told him that his body camera was now federal evidence. She also told him that his gun and his police badge would be taken away right then and there. Hauer's voice cracked as he tried to make an excuse, saying again that he was just answering a call. Crawford didn't want to hear it. She told him they would talk about that at the FBI office. 2 other FBI agents walked up to Hauer. One agent took the officer's weapon. The other agent wore blue gloves as he carefully removed the body camera from Hauer's chest. He handled the camera very carefully because it was now the most important piece of evidence in a federal criminal case. From the same gray sofa where the trouble started, Dominic watched as the FBI began their work. He knew he had sent 31 officers to prison before, and he was certain that Brandon Hauer was going to be number 32. The investigation into Officer Brandon Hauer moved with the speed of a high-speed train because the victim was a top federal prosecutor. Within hours, the FBI had secured the body cam footage, which showed 11 minutes of the encounter from start to finish. They also collected video from 4 different cameras at the dealership, including one directly above the lounge that clearly showed Hauer grabbing Dominic's arm. But the real smoking gun was found when digital experts looked at Hauer's personal cell phone. They found text messages that proved Hauer was not just making a mistake, he was a person with deep-seated biases. He belonged to group chats where he and other people joked about racial profiling. In one message sent just 3 days before the incident, Hauer wrote that rich neighborhoods were the best places to work because people would call the police for anything, making it easy for him to get stats. The FBI also looked at his records from the 14 weeks he had been on the force. Out of 19 times he stopped citizens, 17 of those people were from minority groups. Not a single one of those stops resulted in an arrest or a ticket, which proved he was just stopping people because of how they looked. They even uncovered the truth about how he got his job. Records showed he had failed background checks at 2 other police departments because of his bad attitude and mean comments. He only got hired in Atlanta because his cousin, a city councilman, pushed his application through and ignored all the warning signs. With all this evidence, the federal grand jury didn't take long to decide. They charged Hauer with several serious crimes, including assault on a federal officer and violating civil rights. The case against the 32nd officer on Dominic's list was now stronger than ever. The trial was held in a federal courtroom in Washington, D.C. to make sure everything was fair. Because Dominic Cross knew so many judges and lawyers in Georgia, the government moved the case to a neutral place. The trial lasted 5 days, and the room was packed with people watching to see if justice would be served. The prosecutors showed the jury the 11 minutes of body cam footage. The jury watched as Officer Hauer demanded that Dominic step outside and ignored every logical explanation. They saw the moment Hauer laughed at the mention of federal credentials and the exact second he grabbed Dominic's arm to pull him off the sofa. The evidence was so clear that it was hard to argue against. When it was time for Dominic to testify, he made a very specific choice. He didn't wear a fancy suit. Instead, he wore the exact same jeans and black shirt he had been wearing on the day he was assaulted. He wanted the jury to see that what you wear should not change how the law treats you. He told the jury that he had spent 9 years building cases like this, but he never expected to be the victim himself. He explained that his only weapon that day was staying calm and documenting the truth. The defense lawyers tried to say it was all a big misunderstanding and that Hauer was just doing his job. But the prosecution was ready. They pointed out that Hauer made a choice to ignore the truth. He chose not to check the service records, he chose to laugh at the ID, and he chose to use force. After listening to all the evidence, the jury went into a private room to decide the officer's fate. It only took them 4 hours to come back with a guilty verdict on every single count. The day of the sentencing brought people from all over the country to the courthouse. The case had become a major symbol for police accountability. Brandon Hauer stood in the courtroom, no longer wearing a proud uniform, but looking like a man who finally realized his mistakes. The judge looked at the thick pile of evidence before her. She spoke about Hauer's failed background checks and the way his cousin had wrongly helped him get the job. She talked about the racist text messages and the long list of people he had stopped just because of their skin color. "Officer Hauer, you had 14 weeks to learn what it means to wear a badge," the judge said with a very serious voice. "Instead, you proved why other departments rejected you." The judge explained that because Hauer had attacked a federal official and showed a pattern of breaking civil rights laws, his punishment would be much harder. She wanted the sentence to show that no one is above the law. Without any emotion, she delivered the final blow: 30 years in federal prison with no chance of getting out early for good behavior. Hauer was led away in handcuffs, just like he had once threatened to do to Dominic. His 14-week career had cost him 30 years of his freedom. But the consequences didn't stop with him. His cousin, the city councilman, was forced to resign. 3 bosses at the police department were fired for letting Hauer onto the force, and the police chief quit shortly after. Even the dealership manager, Gerald Patterson, was fired for his role in calling the police. The system that had protected Hauer was finally being cleaned up. The city eventually settled with Dominic for $12.5 million. While many people would have taken the money and disappeared, Dominic had a bigger plan. He kept enough for his family and his personal safety, but he took $5 million and started a special project called the Equal Justice Legal Fund. This fund was created to provide free lawyers to regular people who were victims of racial profiling but didn't have a federal badge to protect them. "This money exists because I was sitting in a car dealership," Dominic said when he announced the fund. He wanted to make sure that even people without his education or status could fight back and win. 6 months after the trial, Dominic was promoted to chief of the civil rights section for the entire southern region. He now watches over 5 different states, making sure that what happened to him doesn't happen to anyone else. Even with his new high-ranking job, Dominic still drives his Mercedes-AMG GT. He still takes it to Prestige Motors for service, though the dealership is now under new management with much better rules. He deliberately sits on the same gray sofa in the same customer lounge while he waits. As he sits by the large glass windows, he is a living reminder that the lounge was never the problem was an officer who thought he could use his power to bully others. That officer is now in a prison cell, while the cop hunter continues his work. Dominic Cross proved that when the law is used correctly, the truth will always stay standing.